Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome back. Today we're here with an update on how the season is shaping up and what we're seeing across the state. As you may have guessed from listening to the past few episodes, this season has been a roller coaster. And Amanda and I were joking about how we use that term a lot, but when it's the right word for what we're describing, I don't know what else we can say about it. This one really has been a roller coaster. We dealt early on with some cold weather and rain. And I know I've talked to a lot of guys about when is the wind going to stop blowing? And all of these factors have challenged both our crop development and our field work this spring and early summer. But hopefully, now that July is here, we're hoping that conditions will level out and things will look up from here. Today, we've got Dr. Stephanie Karhoff joining us to discuss what we're seeing and some things to keep an eye out for over the next few weeks. So, welcome, Stephanie. Could you take a minute and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Amanda. So, like you said, my name is Stephanie Karhoff, and I'm a field specialist in agronomic systems for Ohio State University Extension.
We're excited to have Steph on because she is my counterpart in the northern half of the state. So hopefully between the two of us, we've seen a lot of what's going on. I'm excited to hear, Steph. I haven't made a drive north in a while. So I'm excited to see how things are looking up there because I know it's very different compared to what we've had down in the southern part of the state.
Correct. Yes, and it's a mixed bag up here too, depending where you're at in the state in terms of how much rain you've gotten. And it seems like either it's too much or not enough. Just like you said, that roller coaster, either we're going up high or too far low. But what I'm seeing right now, just starting with soybean, is a little bit slower growth and some yellowing in those soybeans. So saw a lot of different stressors, some excess moisture, as well as now getting in to do those post herbicide applications. We can sometimes see that temporary yelling in that soybeans, even if they are tolerant to herbicides. Not sure if that matches what you're seeing in your half of the state or not.
I think it does, especially, around here we've got that wide range of planting dates. We had beans that went in a lot in early April, even some in late March this year. And then with the conditions, we had a pretty wide gap there in some of our planting dates. And when we look at that, the May planted beans, they just don't feel like they're coming on like they should be. And I don't know if part of that is the comparison factor where we've got some stuff that had a big head start on it. But I mean, they came out of the ground or didn't come out of the ground right there, right after they were planted with that cold, wet weather. I've had a couple guys call about some bare spots in fields. That's probably with some seedling diseases that took out some areas, some pockets in fields that we missed when we were replanting and patching in. But yeah, it feels like we've been a little behind. And I kept telling guys, once we get some, heat units, it'll turn around. But it hasn't happened as fast as even I expected it to this spring.
Yeah, and it seems like corn's a pretty similar story where we're seeing some stunting from corn I've walked recently. We range anywhere between V6 to those that are head high and nearing tasseling here in this portion of the state. And then as long as we get to that stage of reproductive stages, I know here we're just about reaching that point. And then further south, talking to both of you, you guys have reached tasseling in that earlier planted corn. But now's the time to really start looking for those early signs of foliar disease in the lower canopy, especially with the humidity that we've been experiencing the past few weeks.
Yeah, tar spot has been a topic of conversation. Steph, you and I exchanged some communication on that yesterday with us approaching tassel and finding some tar spot already. Very minimally, you really have to search for it, but it is out there. So I know we've talked about this with you in the past, but just refresh on if we're finding it now, especially if you're maybe a couple weeks away from tassel and the weather that we have going on, what recommendations are moving forward.
So right now, I'd recommend holding off on that fungicide application because we do have low disease pressure. So tar spots out there, but at very, very low levels in the fields that have been reported. That and as we are before tasseling, we're not going to see probably a return on investment in that fungicide application that early. So holding off on fungicide applications, but still being diligent about our scouting. So going out and looking at those fields and making sure disease isn't progressing further to a point where we would need that application, especially with the humidity that we're experiencing. And as we look past this week, temperatures cooling off compared to this week, and getting closer to that ideal range for that tar spot pathogen to take off.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's going to make this an interesting year for tar spot is just that wide range in crop development that we've got down here. At least we've got corn that's tasseling and we've got corn that we're just finishing up side dress on. So several weeks apart in terms of development. That later planted stuff's going to be something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, similar story to last year where we had that wide range of planting dates, and then that translated, of course, to that variety in crop development and field activity. So it just makes it even more difficult to manage when we have that widespread of growth stages and timing. Because as we know, if that disease, whether it's tar spot or another disease, if it comes in early enough, it's going to impact more of that grain fill period, more of that pod development in soybean, and probably have a greater impact on our yield.
Yeah, I will add, I think that's one we're probably all complaining about the heat wave that's come on this last week. But with tar spot, that's a bit of a saving grace, right? It's going to hold off the disease development because it tends to prefer that cooler weather. We're officially out of the sweet spot for now, maybe for tar spot.
Correct. Yeah, that sweet spot as far as temperatures is usually in that mid 70-degree Fahrenheit for the tar spot fungus. And a nice tool to get a really quick gauge on what that current risk is for tar spot in your field, as well as a few other diseases like gray leaf spot in corn, on soybean, frog eye leaf spot, is the Crop Protection Network has what's called a crop risk tool. And this tool allows you to input your field location, and it's going to pull your current weather forecast and the next 7-day forecast. And it's going to give you an idea whether you have high, medium, or low risk of that disease in that field.
And then a shameless plug for eFields from me. With this year being a unique year and tar spot being a relatively new disease for us, we're still learning a lot about how it shows up in the field and how it impacts yield down the road. So we've got our tar spot survey study going on. So if you are seeing tar spot, or if you're not, and you're curious as to whether or not it's making an impact on your yields and you want to help us out, reach out to your county educator and we can help with some scouting and some data collection so that down the road we can better understand when the disease risks and yield impact risks are highest for tar spot. Fun opportunity to get involved with if you're still wanting to do some on-farm research this year.
Yeah, so we encourage folks to use that tool that Stephanie mentioned, as well as take a look at some of the research that has been done on effectiveness of our different fungicides. Ensure that you are treating your field for the disease with the most effective products to help protect your crop against that. We don't want to forget about Dawn as well, vomitoxin, which that infection happens at tassel. So these are all things we need to be keeping in mind at this point. And Stephanie, that's another thing you've been working on is that vomitoxin and spray effectiveness.
Yes, and in that crop risk tool, it's really convenient because it's a one-stop shop. So you can look at that tar spot forecast, like we mentioned, and thanks to some tremendous funding from the Ohio Corn Marketing Program and work done widely here in Ohio, led by Pierce Paul and Jason Hartshu, we also have in that risk tool a forecast system on whether or not you're likely to accumulate DON above 1 parts per million in that field. So that's a really another useful tool, especially with that disease and that mycotoxin associated with the disease. That's one where we have to spray before we see that disease. So unlike tar spot, we can't walk that field, gauge how much disease pressure there is, and then make that call if we have that flexibility in our spray program. With Gibberella, we have to spray before that infection. So we're really using that predictive tool to guide that decision and make sure that we're maintaining corn yield, but also grain quality, especially when we're talking about vomitoxin or DON.
I like the risk tool because it will tell you when your crop is vulnerable as well. So if it's a specific disease that you're seeing and you want to see, what is the risk? Like tar spot risk was pretty high last week, but it's dropping off because of those high temperatures. And of course, we are most concerned about that as it approaches tassel. So you can use that information all provided right there in the tool to determine, well, I'm not at tassel yet. I'm going to be at tassel in maybe a week's time, and the risk period currently is saying it's low. So it just provides a lot of details to help you make those decisions. Again, if you have the flexibility in your spray program to utilize that.
Yes, yeah, that's a great reminder. So that's the caveat is you could have a high risk forecast, but if your crop's not in that vulnerable stage, so let's say just prior to or at that early silking period for gibberella ear rot and Don, that's not going to apply to that field. And then, of course, we're making that pretty wide assumption that you got the flexibility in your spray program, which I know, especially for those that are using a custom applicator, whether it's a ground rig or especially so if they're using aerial applications, a lot of times you're locked in based on their availability, but it's still a tool available and one that you can use for free, readily available on your computer or accessing it on your mobile device.
Steph, have you guys had much nitrogen loss? We had excessive rain. Things around here, Elizabeth and I were talking a little about look decent. We were able to get our side dress on. How are things looking for corn up your way?
Surprisingly well, because that was a concern for us too. A lot of those rains seem to be delaying that side dress application, but fortunately, we were able to capture that window and get things side dressed. I know there's still some that needs to be side dressed, especially that later planted corn in our area as you move further north and west from where I'm at. But I always forget about that ugly duckling stage with corn and then how fast it takes off once
Mhm.
you give it that side dress application. So you think by now I would remember it, but it always takes me by storm.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel the same way with sometimes with soybeans too, especially when we have a wet spring, they do look kind of awkward. And then all of a sudden, they fill in and can yield pretty well.
Yeah, I think we're seeing corn right now down here turn that corner, right? It just
Hmm.
in the last week or so, you drive around, everything is canopied, it looks green, and you breathe that sigh of relief. Hopefully for beans, that's coming up in just a few days for us.
I hope so too. And I haven't purposely left out beans. It seems like we talk more about corn here, but it just seems like beans, we've talked about it in other podcast episodes. They're just more resilient than corn. And I know there's yellowing and stunting right now, but I'm confident if we can get the right weather, those canopies are going to close and we can get those beans taken off, just like you said, round that corner and start looking a little bit stronger as well.
With soybeans, frog eye leaf spot seems to be on the rise a little bit more concerning than maybe it had a decade or so ago. So keep an eye out for that. Some of you with low-lying areas, white mold is another one, and those are also in that crop risk tool, correct?
Yes, both frog eye leaf spot and white mold, Sclerotinia white mold are included in that crop risk tool for soybean. And then as we're scouting, still early to probably see those visible symptoms, but a newer disease in Ohio for soybean is red crown rot. So keeping an eye out for that new disease in your field, which is difficult because it can be easily confused with the other soybean diseases that we're already trained to diagnose. So later, as we get closer to August and those later reproductive stages in soybean, we can start to see above ground symptoms really similar to sudden death syndrome or brown stem rot or others, where you see the vein in that soybean leaf remain green, and then around that vein, yellowing and then browning of those leaves. So if we're seeing those, taking the time to inspect closer, even dig up that plant and looking for affected roots. So looking at it and seeing if we're having really poor root growth. And in some cases, you might actually be able to see a sign of that pathogen where you'll see pinprick red structures about as small as the tip of a pencil, so it can be really difficult to see. But if you're unsure and you suspect that something might be at play, whether it's red crown rot or another soybean disease, we're really fortunate to have our soybean pathologist, Horacio Lopez Nicora, and some support for his group to do some diagnostic work. So samples can be collected, whether whole plant or portions of that plant, and sent to his group to get further tested.
Yeah, I have a feeling with some of the early season stress we saw in those beans that SDS is going to be something, sudden death syndrome is going to be something we'll probably see sooner rather than later as we move into those later stages. So perhaps Horacio will join us next time to talk about getting some samples pulled because that SDS is one of those things that tends to show up when we have, wet feet early and that stress that disease tends to follow. So good reminder, Steph. And I know I've already had one guy call wanting to know about when we were going to pull samples for red crown rot. So good to have it on our radar early.
Absolutely. There's always too much to think of at once and not enough time to sample everything, but I'm sure we'll be collecting lots of samples later this year, just trying to gauge what the spread is for that newer disease in soybean, as well as the other ones that we already talked about, like SDS.
Well, Steph, we certainly appreciate your time today. Thanks for filling us in on what's going on up your direction and some of those reminders on diseases and scouting. We'll link up the crop risk tool so folks can start utilizing that to help make decisions. And we will see what I guess the next couple weeks bring for everyone.
All right. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.